And then clinical trials is where you're actually using a medication or I guess I should say potential medication in a human individual or individuals. Yeah, and maybe we side shoot here and talk about, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, post-marketing, because, we just talked about that with the FDA approval process. And we have an example of a peptide that actually has gone through some of these things now. So we'll shoot off to the side here. So phases of a clinical trial. Even before you get to a clinical trial, when you hear someone talk about the preclinical data, that's talking about either in vitro or in an animal model. And then clinical trials is where you're actually using a medication or I guess I should say potential medication in a human individual or individuals. So you have phase 1. These are typically very small studies. You have maybe several dozen individuals, and they're just looking at the pharmacokinetics. So how quickly is this drug metabolized? What are the blood levels? Are there any toxic effects? What happens if you give 1 milligram? What happens if you give 100 milligrams? Kind of establishing the, safety window of the medication and how tolerable it is. So we know some medications have a lot of GI effects. Some medications are going to cause headaches for people. Some medications are going to make people very drowsy. Basically just making note of what happens in a healthy individual, not even necessarily the target population for that. Then we have phase 2A and 2B, which are a little bit confusing because there's no explicit definitions, and you even see in the published studies sometimes they're contradicting, like, well, we're saying this is a 2B trial, but it looks a lot like a 2A trial. So what's that all about?
Yeah, so this is looking at dosing and efficacy. And like you said, there's a lot of crossover, but this aims to be more clinically significant for its therapeutic use. So how do we dose this medication? Not just what its pharmacokinetics are. What can we do to address the pathophysiology of the condition that we're treating? So, for example, is it addressing the root cause? Where in the current literature does it fit in with the treatment?
Yeah, so you have the 2A is supposed to be aimed at narrowing the dose, and the 2B is supposed to be aimed at like a specific clinical condition. That doesn't always happen because these things cross over a lot. And as we'll mention, another trial described itself as a 2B/3 study to further complicate things. So phase 3 is typically where medications are at for their FDA approval. So you have them compared to either another medication that's used for treatment of something or to whatever the standard of care is at time, because there are some conditions out there where there is no standard or there's no medication. There's a standard of care, like this is what we usually do for these people, but there's not a medication there. I suppose an example of this, a recent phase 3 trial that probably got more attention than any other phase 3 trial in history, related to the GLP-1 medications, and they were not actually compared to like an alternative weight loss medication, but they were compared to a sort of standard of care of eat less and move more. Got that one backwards. And the lifestyle arm of that wasn't particularly successful, and we've pointed out some of the problems there. But that's a good example of a phase 3 trial where they took a medication targeted for obesity compared to something that is done in practice for obesity, paired with a placebo, and then looked at the results and what those differences were.
Generally, after these phase 3 trials are done, that you look at it for approval, there is ways that you can pay for expedited approval, which I'm not an expert in that area, but it does seem a little bit off to me to be able to pay for your expedited approval, especially if there's other medications also in development in the same class. But perhaps a medical director, MSL at some point could give us more insight into that mechanism within the FDA approval process. And then after that, as you mentioned, they have the data afterwards, sometimes referred to as stage 4.
Yeah, and the post-marketing data. And this is where you see sort of breakthrough things or side effects that weren't seen in the trials, because the trials may only have, 10,000 people total that were studied, even fewer if you go back farther in time. Like one that I know off the top of my head is Viagra or sildenafil now. That was maybe about 5,000 people total that were studied before it got its approval. I think the trials are a bit larger now depending on the condition and how large the population needs to be for that study to be adequately powered. But there are things that are always not going to be caught whenever you're going through the phase 1, 2, and 3.
These are very helpful. And it's not like the medication stays or it goes. Often it ends with a new black box warning.
Yeah, that's something that has, I believe, been applied to like Singular as an example there, because there's some potential psychiatric concerns that have been seen that were not initially exposed during the phase 1 and 2 and 3 trials. But again, it's a small problem. It's not something that you're going to see manifested in the short time frames that you saw, and it's not something they were necessarily looking for in those phase 1, 2, and 3 trials.